thank you to this HPV Prevention Board for all this organization and for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here with you, and I'm going to talk about the transition from cytology to HPV-based screening. I'm involved in pathology and genetics, and I'm in routine and molecular biology. So we have different parts in this talk. Why to test HPV? Of course, it was a quick reminder about the HPV context also and transition, and we will take time about healthcare settings and little controversies and also co-testing. So as you know, HPV is the necessary cause of cervix cancers. There are two preventions. The main prevention is, of course, vaccination since 2007 in France, and Gardasil 9 was introduced in 2018. The secondary prevention is, of course, HPV primary screening for women more than 30 years in France. It was accorded in 2019 by the HAS, the High Authority of Health, and the organization, the national organization, is pending region per region. Why all that? Because you know that majority of HPV infection will clear, a minority will persist, and even if you have SIN2 or SIN3, they may regress. As you can see here in the table, 43% of regression for SIN2 and about 30% for SIN3. Next. So to make a good screening, we need a good sensitivity, and we had numerous cohorts and randomized studies in the literature since many, many years. As you know, cytology has a lower sensitivity. It's the reason we had to repeat it. And the second problem is that the predictive positive value will decrease with vaccination. HPV testing has the higher sensitivity and has also a higher negative predictive value. This is the reason of possible extended testing in time, about 5 years. As you can see here, you have many tests with a good sensitivity and not so bad specificity, Papillon-Check, COBAS, Aptima, and so on. Next. Now, after these reminders, what about the HPV context for transition? Next. For transition, we have to switch from cytology or co-testing, we will see that at the end of this slide, to primary HPV screening, included a triage for specificity. The base is that we have numerous HPV, even if we just study 13 or 14 high-risk HPV. We have numerous HPV tests. We have also many new markers pending. The quality of samples is always very, very important, especially with liquid-based cytology and now self-samples. We know also that one test is not enough. We need two, screening and triage. So we may have a different algorithm to screen. Next. Second point, we do not have to forget vaccination, and screening and vaccination are synergic. And we do not have to forget other HPV-induced cancers, especially anal canal cancer and oropharyngeal cancer, for example. So at total, we always need to increase, to simplify, and to standardize HPV screening processes. Next, please. This is the classical HPV screening, primary screening for France, which has begun in 2019 after a positive test, of course. For triage, we chose in France cytology, and if it is more than an ASCUS, it can go to colposcopy. And if it is positive, if it is negative if cytology is negative after HPV test positive, we do again an HPV testing 1 year later. And if it is positive colposcopy and negative, we go back 5 years later, like a negative test at the beginning. Next. So this is a slide of a study of Mavel and Mario Poljak recently, where they study the various cervical cancer screening policies in Europe. And as you can see, Netherlands and Turkey have totally implemented their screening. Many other countries, implement their study. And France, the authorization was in 2019, so it's pending region by region for a national organization. Next, please. Now, What about healthcare settings and controversies? I could say there are quite light controversies, but we have to speak about them. I tried to use many papers, and especially the one of Vincent and Harbin in 2017. So how to switch to HPV-based screening? We have to define, I would say, 5 major points. The assays, the HPV assays, the triage test, the screening interval for HPV negative women, the integrated HPV screening with notably vaccination. Next, please. What about HPV screening assays? Major studies of Ronco and Al show that HPV testing given a good early detection and diagnosis of things 3 and a long-term protection. So it is more effective to detect precancerous lesion at the first round than cytology-based screening. The cancer risk at 3 years after a negative HPV test is 70% lower compared to a negative cytology. HPV is useful when cytology offers a lower performance. We have to underline also that HPV do not give discrimination between transient and or persistent HPV infection. And we have to remind that it's easy to detect HPV detection. It's easy to detect HPV detection, but it's not always easy to have a clinical signification. An advantage of HPV testing is that there is no difference of efficacy with age, with particularly a higher protection of women of 30 to 35 years old. So at total for transition, there is an evidence of higher program efficiency of HPV-based screening. There is a better follow-up generally with the same HPV test. And FDA approved 5 assays at present time. And we have also in literature international criteria and guidelines that I'm going to show you next. Quickly, the 5 tests approved by FDA were very well known. We captured 2, Savista, Cobas, Aptima, BD, OncoClarity, which can detect different genes of HPV, L1, E67, and so on, and with different techniques, PCR or not. Next, just to remind you the main 14 high-risk HPV, just to show you quickly that there are different HPV tests. HPV testing without any genotyping, cocktail test. HPV testing with complete genotyping, useful for vaccination controls. HPV testing with partial genotyping, frequently used for screening. But we have also assays to detect rare HPV variants, integration, viral load, and so on. And also now indirect markers, which are the consequence of infection. You do not know the HPV, but you know there is an infection, using P16 or methylation, for example. Next. We have also many studies about validations of HPV assays with gold standard. We have international guidelines. We have clinical validations with the famous paper of Chris Meyer, Stoller, and Harbin. We have all the Valgent studies for the different assays with Mark Harbin. In France, we have the recommendations of the HPV National Center of Reference, as you saw during the talk of Jean-Luc Prétet just before me. And we have recently a list of HPV tests for primary screening by Mark Harbin. Next. After the screening, the triage, which is required, as you know. For that, we have to define precancer endpoints like SIN2+, 2 high-risk HPV positive test, especially HPV 16 and 18 or 33 positive. So there is a risk stratification using triage program up to colposcopy, as you can see on the famous scheme of Nicolas Vincenzen. For triage, there are various options, but the optimal strategy is limited, as we will see in some seconds. The aim is to not miss a high-grade lesion, to check persistence, to not increase colposcopy, and to not overtreat. Next. So what about triage test? There is a growing number of different options with new molecular tests in parallel. Cytology is used in many countries, like in France. We have also possibility of partial or total HPV genotyping. Viral load, not still approved. P16 and K67, more longitudinal studies are needed. Methylation signatures, which are very interesting, on viral genes or human genes. E6 protein detection, and now tumor biomarkers, especially for treatments. For all that, we have not enough large comparison, and longitudinal studies are still missing. New markers are pending, and maybe we will have to simplify in the future the test. Maybe we will have to use global testing using just one test, for example, NGS DNA sequencing, in which you can include genotyping, methylation, markers, and so on. So it's quite fast, and the price, of course, will have to decrease. So this is the future and suggestion for future. Next, after screening and triage, the intervals, especially for HPV negative women. So 5 years is an important point, and it gives a better safety than cytology analysis every 3 years, with a decrease of the frequent screening. Next, 5 years, so extended intervals are very safe. It means that we need a good compliance of women for these longer intervals, and of course, education of women. About physicians, medical practitioners, gyneco, they have to accept recommendation against annual pelvic examination. So they need formation, and they need also robust ease of computer to check screening of women. Next, after HPV triage intervals, the globality with integrate HPV screening. Sure, we have many differences between countries, cultures, infrastructures, settings, the cost, the healthcare funds. We have also to switch countries with low cervical cancer rates and established cytology-based screening, which is not always easy. Next, to evaluate the performance of an entire screening program, we need different organization about the management of HPV positive women, about the follow-up at longer intervals, the need of compliance, as we said before, the control of treatments, the need of an organized administration, the adherence of screening policy, the good invitations and reminders. Do not forget that the majority of cervical cancer are in women who not participate in regular screening. And of course, the increased use of self-sampling kits. You can get them by mail, or you can find them in pharmacy, and we have an experience of that in France with good results to increase the coverage. Before, please. To increase the coverage of the screening. But for self-sampling, an important point is to use sensitive HPV PCR assays, which is very important. Next, for transition, the challenge is also a synergic integration of screening and vaccination programs, as we introduced before. So sure that an organized settings with vaccination and screening registries is very important, with a continuous decrease of cervical cancer risk in time. And now we have also vaccinated women who reach the age of screening. All that must be integrated. The future, we hope, will be organized vaccination for young girls and boys, maybe at school or not. It's different in Europe, as we will see in 1 second. And in the long term with vaccination, do not forget that we will have a decrease of positive predictive value of cytology, and also a decrease of HPV types, some HPV types with lower cervical cancer risk at total. Next, just to show you quickly HPV vaccination coverage in Europe. As you can see, the number are very different. I show you just here in yellow the S for school, and as you can see, not all the countries in Europe vaccinate at schools. Next. Just to finish, co-testing versus HPV testing alone. The aim is to not miss a subset of cervical cancer, which could be HPV negative and cytology abnormal positive. What is the explanation of negative HPV test in cervical cancer? First, it's very rare, and it would be some very rare cervical cancer could not be caused by HPV. Very strange, but no proof. Second, rare cervical cancer caused by rare high-risk HPV are not included in the panel of the famous 13-14 high-risk HPV types. Third, during HPV integration, some parts of HPV genome, L1 for example, or L2, before please, may be lost, and numerous HPV assays have used L1 probes. So there is not enough evaluation about that. And fourth, which is a general point, the quality of samples is always important, and we may find necrotic materials, but it's not so frequent, fortunately. A total for transition, there is actually limited benefit of adding cytology to HPV testing. First, it's more expensive with many HPV negative and normal cytology cases to manage. After negative HPV test, an additional cytology negative do not provide more reassurance. And using the paper of Batla, you can see that addition of cytology to HPV test raised sensitivity by only 5% for SIN2 plus and 2% for SIN3 plus compared to HPV test alone, and a total with loss of specificity. The cytology component contributed only 5 cases per million women per year to the sensitivity of the combined test. So, no interest to add cytology to HPV testing. In conclusion, next please. Next. So there is a good efficiency of HPV screening. Cytologic triage at present time exists, but it could change because of the impact of self-sampling, and molecular tests are better on self-sampling, and the impact of vaccination with the decrease of PPV, of cytology, and of the main HPVs. Next. So at present time, two tests, screening with partial genotyping and cytology, are very well used in the world. The next assays could be independent of genotyping. For example, P16Q67 for triage. Maybe we miss longitudinal studies, but sure that some authors showed a cumulative risk of SIN2 plus at 5 years, which is superior at abnormal cytology. Methylation testing are very interesting about viral gene, L1, L2, for example, but also methylation of human genes. They are very numerous, and we need certainly a large study to compare them. A global testing combining HPV genotyping and methylation targets could be very interesting. We also could add molecular markers for targeted therapies. Do not forget another point for cancers now. It's possible to study circulating tumor DNA for diagnosis and follow-up of treatments, but it is another story. Thank you for your attention.